July 30, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. Rain fell sideways in stinging sheets as thunder cracked overhead. The road, if it could still be called that, was a churning pit of mud, twisted wreckage, and burned-out transport vehicles. The 3rd Armored Division, almost 180 tanks strong, was stuck, dead still, on a narrow stretch of what had once been a backcountry road leading to the high ground east of Saint-Lô. A key flank was hanging wide open, and Patton's Third Army, already lunging forward in Operation Cobra, was expecting those tanks to punch through German lines today. But they weren't going anywhere. 5 Shermans had already thrown their tracks trying to push forward. 2 tank retrievers sat helpless, tilted at grotesque angles in the mud like wounded animals. Convoys were backed up for miles, every minute ticking louder than the thunder. The 498th Field Maintenance Battalion, tasked with keeping the armored column mobile, had been working for 22 hours straight. Tempers were flaring. Radios were bursting with static and panicked field orders. And that's when Corporal Jack Wrench Halvorsen wiped a greasy hand across his brow, squinted past the tree line to the left of the jammed road, and muttered just loud enough for his sergeant to hear, "I think I know a way through." The sergeant laughed, not kindly. "Through what? The forest? It's nothing but hedgerows and bogs. You want to drive a 33-ton Sherman through there, be my guest." But Halvorsen wasn't joking. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't an officer. He was a mechanic, 27 years old, from a machine shop in rural Minnesota, the kind of guy who rebuilt farm tractors in his sleep and once rerouted the cooling system on a Stuart light tank using tubing from a milk separator. He wasn't supposed to be making tactical decisions. But what no one knew, not his not the division commander, and certainly not Patton, was that 3 days earlier, Halvorsen had wandered off the designated supply zone to scavenge for parts after an airburst took out their mobile workshop. He'd stumbled across an overgrown logging path behind a collapsed stone wall. It twisted between dense forest, crossed a shallow creek, and according to the contour map in his oil-stained notebook, connected to a farm road that ran directly behind the German anti-tank line. Now, in the middle of a stalled offensive, Halvorsen wasn't suggesting a shortcut to save time. He was proposing a flanking maneuver, through terrain no sane commander would even scout. The sergeant told him to shut it, said there was no way command would greenlight something so reckless. But 3 hours later, after 2 tank battalions had burned their engines trying to move 300 yards forward, and a recon jeep came back shredded by German artillery, desperation changed the tone. Captain Riley, red-eyed and soaked to the bone, was pacing outside a half-destroyed farmhouse being used as a makeshift command post. The moment he heard shortcut and forest, he rolled his eyes, until Halvorsen unfolded his scribbled map and pointed to a stream crossing marked with an X. "Here," Halvorsen said, "it's firm. There's gravel under the topsoil, old timber road. You take the lead tank slow, then follow with half-tracked recovery vehicles. You'll be out of the bottleneck in under 3 hours." Riley stared at him. "If you're wrong, we lose half a division in a forest. You understand that, right?" Halvorsen didn't blink. "If I'm right, we're on their flank by sundown." They didn't have a better option. The Germans had zeroed their mortars on the stalled column. Already, the unmistakable whine of Nebelwerfer rockets was rising in the distance. The forest wasn't the risk anymore. Waiting was. And so, command gave him 6 men, 1 bulldozer tank and 2 half-tracks full of engineers with chainsaws, axes, and winches. Not exactly a spearhead, but it would have to do. By 1400 hours, Halvorsen was climbing onto the back of a Sherman, barking instructions to the lead driver like a man possessed. Rain still coming down, engine grease clinging to his uniform, he pointed past the crumbled stone wall. "Put it in low gear and follow me. If we get stuck, we winch it. If we hit water, we walk it." The driver blinked. "You walk a tank." Halvorsen grinned. "Watch me." Within minutes the first Sherman was plowing through the tree line. Trees cracked and gave way. Mud sprayed, tracks spun and gripped, and somehow, impossibly, the earth held. The sound was deafening. Not just engines and chainsaws, but the groan of living forest being pushed aside by roaring machines of war. A corporal with the 498th snapped a photo of Halvorsen standing in the turret hatch, soaked and screaming directions, the tailpipe of the bulldozer tank glowing orange in the gloom. He would later say it looked like something out of a Norse myth. What no one could have expected was how fast the forest opened up once the first kilometer was cleared. The timber road was there, twisting, narrow, muddy, but intact. The maps had missed it. The recon planes hadn't seen it through the canopy, but Halvorsen's gut and his memory had been right. By 1700 hours, the first 5 Shermans emerged from the woods onto a farm road behind the German positions. By 1830, they had eyes on the enemy's exposed flank. And by 1900, artillery spotters were radioing in stunned reports. "Tanks are tanks, advancing from the east." The German defenses collapsed in under 40 minutes. They had never even laid mines behind them. Why would they? No one was supposed to come from the woods. But someone had. And it all began with one mechanic, a muddy notebook, and a shortcut no officer would have dared attempt. The second Sherman slipped through the gap like a predator breaking from brush. Its treads churned with a rhythmic slap of wet mud and pine needles, and its engine grumbled low like a bear disturbed from hibernation. Behind it came the half-track engineers, heads low under ponchos, chainsaws strapped across their backs, and axes slung in makeshift leather harnesses. They weren't soldiers now. They were pathfinders, dragging an entire armored spearhead behind them by force of will. Halvorsen stood perched on the rear step of the bulldozer tank, his boots soaked, one hand gripping a steel cable as if the whole weight of the division depended on it. And in truth, it did. The path he had gambled on was real, but usable was another matter. The forest was ancient, tangled with forgotten hedgerows and dense undergrowth. Every 20 yards, a tree root threatened to rip up a Sherman's track or throw a half-track off its wheelbase. The ground was soft in all the wrong places. One missed branch, one collapse of soil, and the whole column would be jammed deep in the woods like a cork in a bottle. By the time the 4th tank entered the tree line, the lead vehicle hit trouble. A deep rut, hidden under brambles, swallowed the right track and tilted the Sherman sideways with a groan. For a moment, everyone froze. Then Halvorsen leapt down, wrench in one hand, cable hook in the other, shouting before his boots even hit the ground. "Chain the winch to the birch on the right. Reverse the rear tread, feather it, now don't throttle, rock it." The tank's engine howled, whined, then caught traction. The birch tree bent like a bow. The tread chewed through roots and dragged the tank back onto the path with a squelch and a blast of black smoke. The mechanics behind him cheered, but Halvorsen didn't celebrate. He just pointed forward. "Cut that brush down. You've got 90 seconds before the next one hits the same hole." He didn't have authority, but after that moment nobody cared. Command was miles behind. Radios barely reached back through the trees. In that forest, soaked in diesel and tension, Halvorsen was the lead. By nightfall, they'd cleared 2.8 miles, less than half the distance to the rendezvous with the farm road. But they were still moving. And now came the next problem: elevation. The path narrowed at a rocky ridge choked with moss and trees. The incline was steep, too steep for a Sherman without prep. Worse, the forest had thickened into a cathedral of ancient oaks and dark underbrush. No way through with the tanks as they were. Halvorsen surveyed the slope. The sun had dipped behind the clouds, turning the forest into a dim green tunnel. And then he pointed to the engineers. "Start cutting. Widen the path 2 feet on each side. We're going up and over." One of the engineers, a tall, sunburned Kansan named Weller, looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You want to send tanks up that ridge in the dark. We don't even know if there's a drop on the other side. Halvorsen didn't flinch. We don't have time. You want to wait for sunrise and risk the Krauts figuring out where we are. They find us in here boxed in. Artillery wipes us out in 10 minutes. He paused, then added, I'll take the bulldozer up first. If I make it, you follow. He didn't wait for approval. The bulldozer tank fired up with a roar. Halvorsen, soaked, bruised, and running on cold coffee and fury, guided it forward like a man riding a dragon. Trees shattered. Roots exploded. The steel beast clawed its way up the incline, and for one terrible moment the tread spun against a boulder and the whole machine slid sideways. But then it caught. With a heave that made every man in the clearing hold their breath, the bulldozer crested the ridge and disappeared over the top. Silence. Then Halvorsen's voice came crackling through a battered field radio held by Weller. Clear up here flat, and I see the road, I see the road. Cheers broke out like cannon fire. Men dropped to their knees laughing. Someone shouted, I owe that lunatic a bottle of whiskey. But Halvorsen wasn't smiling. Because from the top of that ridge, he saw something else too. A line of telephone poles, cut cleanly by retreating Germans, and beyond them a glint of metal. Tanks, enemy tanks. They weren't alone in this forest anymore. Halvorsen crouched in the hatch, breathing hard. He hadn't counted on this. The maps had shown no sign of an armored unit in this area. But there they were, at least 6 Panzer IVs dug into makeshift revetments at the edge of a field just past the farm road. And they hadn't seen him yet. He radioed back down, voice urgent. Hold the column, hold everyone at the ridge base. I'm coming back down, we've got company. When Halvorsen reached the bottom, Captain Riley was there, face pale and streaked with grime, boots sinking into moss. He had arrived on foot with a small squad to assess progress. You were supposed to be past the ridge by now. We're overdue to link up with Baker Company for the flanking push. What's the holdup? Halvorsen didn't salute. He just pointed back up the hill. 6 Panzers. They're set up past the road. I don't think they know we're here, but we start rolling down that hill without a plan and they'll shred us. Riley looked at him, then up at the ridgeline. You get us this far through hell, and now you're telling me we're blocked. Halvorsen's eyes narrowed. I didn't say we're blocked. I said we need to hit them before they know we're coming. Riley exhaled, considering. Then he tapped his helmet. You got an idea, mechanic? Halvorsen nodded. Yeah, one of the half-tracks has a winch and a boom crane, right? I want to load up one of the 60-pound demolition charges we brought for tree clearing. We send it downhill on a sled, fast. Angle it right, use gravity. Riley blinked. You're going to sled a bomb at a Panzer line. Halvorsen grinned, teeth white in the dusk. You got a better idea. 10 minutes later, engineers were welding together a makeshift sled from tank treads and steel brackets. They strapped the demo charge tight with tension cables, jammed a primer on a timer, and aimed it like a medieval battering ram down a narrow, slick chute they cleared with shovels and branches. 5 seconds after launch, Halvorsen said, ignite the charge. We time it right, it'll explode just past their front line. Flash, shockwave, confusion, we roll in behind it. The soldiers looked at each other, eyes wide. This wasn't doctrine, this wasn't training, this was madness. But it felt like it would work. And so, under a sky cracking with distant artillery, Halvorsen counted down. 3, 2, go. The sled flew down the incline with a howl of metal on moss. It hit a root, bounced, stayed upright, then exploded in a blast that lit up the forest like daylight. The trees groaned, birds screamed, and from the ridgeline they could see Panzers turning, confused, exposed. The Shermans rolled, and the forest that had swallowed them whole now spat them back out with fire in their bellies and steel on their sides. Halvorsen rode the last tank over the ridge, wrench still in hand. He never saw himself as a hero. But on that day, a division moved because of him. And a German line collapsed because no one thought a mechanic with a notebook could rewrite the battlefield. Smoke twisted upward in columns, curling through the canopy as broken trees burned in silence. The demo blast had done more than disorient the enemy. It shattered their coordination. German tank commanders, expecting an attack from the road, were now spinning their turrets toward an unseen threat crashing out of the woods to their flank. And crash they did. The first Sherman crested the ridge at full throttle, tracks biting into the slope like teeth. Its gun was already rotating before the hull fully leveled. Without hesitation, it let loose. An armor-piercing round tore through the early dawn fog and punched clean through the side of a Panzer IV still pivoting on its treads. The explosion lit the field in orange, and the second and third Shermans followed close behind, engines screaming, hulls shaking with the force of the charge. Halvorsen, still riding the fifth tank like a man possessed, slammed his palm against the turret roof. "Move, move, move, don't stop for anything." German forces, likely elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, were repositioning to cut off what they thought was a vulnerable American detachment flanked too deep and unsupported. They didn't realize the scale of what had just emerged from the woods. But the Americans also didn't realize what wasn't working. The radios, all of them. The forest, the moisture, and the disrupted infrastructure had turned most of the forward radios into deadweight. Batteries were failing. Signal towers had been shelled. And now the tanks, many of which had spread out in mobile units to hold the newly gained farm roads, were dangerously low on coordination. Halvorsen had made it through the forest. But now he was stuck in it, unable to call for help, with a handful of tanks and engineers facing the possibility of a German armored counterattack. And then at the edge of the trail, a jeep came sputtering through the fog. It was the mail run. A scrawny corporal named Jennings, barely old enough to shave, handed Halvorsen a battered canvas sack. "Sir," or corporal, "got dispatches. One's from a Lieutenant Dorn at 17th Cav. Said it's urgent." Halvorsen opened it. The note was smudged, written in pencil on a ration wrapper. "We saw German half-tracks headed south by southwest. Appeared to be fanning out. You're between their prongs. Evac if you can. We'll try to relink near Hill 109 by dusk. Godspeed." Halvorsen stared at the note, then at the horizon. Between their prongs. Which meant the forest, his forest, was about to become a trap. And the only way out now was back in. The branches swayed like specters as dawn bled into the forest, and somewhere to the north engines growled, not American ones. It was low, guttural, heavy tracks moving in unison, not recon, not scouts, full troop carriers. Halvorsen stood near a bend in the trail, mud-slick, veined with cracked roots, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He was used to the roar of a Sherman, but this sound had a rhythm, almost mechanical in its perfection. German half-tracks, probably SDKFZ 251s. They were moving in flanking formation. He folded the dispatch from LT. Dorn and shoved it into his boot. Captain Riley crouched beside a damaged half-track, trying to wrench loose a jammed supply crate with a crowbar. He looked up, grim. "They're circling." Halvorsen didn't reply. His eyes were on the trees. Riley kept talking. "If they reach the clearing where we just pushed through, we're boxed in, and we've got no long-range radios. Most of the tanks are scattered. Some pushed ahead down the farm road, some are still making their way down Halvorsen's run. We've got maybe 7 armored vehicles in range." "And 30 engineers," Halvorsen added, "and a forest full of trees." Riley blinked. "That's your plan." Halvorsen didn't smile. "If they want to box us in, fine. Let's give them the box, and then we drop it on them." It began with axes and chainsaws. Every man available, mechanics, engineers, clerks, was ordered into the woods. Halvorsen laid out a hasty schematic in the dirt, using bits of wire and shell casings to mark trails. His plan wasn't elegant. It was desperate. They would rig the trail. The Germans expected to find a fragmented, retreating force. Instead, they'd walk straight into a maze of pre-cut trees, booby-trapped ditches, buried demo charges, and half-tracks hidden under brush, waiting in ambush. The Americans didn't have the numbers, so they'd fight like mechanics, with leverage, pressure, and precisely timed chaos. Trees were pre-sawed at the base and braced upright. All it would take was a single pull from a winch cable or chain rig to drop a whole wall of trunks across a path. Engineers dug shallow, camouflaged trenches under the cover of ferns, planted with anti-vehicle mines looted from German stockpiles days earlier. They even turned the bulldozer tank into a mobile shield, packing it with sandbags and welding extra steel plates over the engine housing. It would block the narrowest portion of Halvorsen's run, forcing any incoming half-track to funnel into a choke point. All of it had to be done in 3 hours. At 9:30, the wind shifted. Then came the first sound: boots in mud. Not tanks, infantry. The 2nd SS had sent their vanguard. Positions, Riley shouted, scrambling up an embankment with field glasses in one hand and a Thompson in the other. Let 'em come. Don't fire until the signal. The signal was simple, a bang, not from a rifle, from Halvorsen's wrench, his old shop wrench, 15 inches of steel he always carried. He de-rigged it to swing down on a metal ammo box if the right tripwire was pulled. 12 minutes later, that box rang out like a bell through the trees. The woods exploded. The first wave of Germans, maybe 40 men in staggered formation, charged into what looked like an abandoned clearing and immediately disappeared in smoke and splinters. 2 pre-cut trees slammed down behind them. Then came a flash. 2 demo charges ripped the undergrowth apart. Shermans hidden behind camo netting opened up, not from the front but from the sides. Firing canisters shot down the natural funnels the Germans had marched into. Bodies fell. Screams echoed. A second wave tried to flank left, but the engineers had felled logs into a natural barricade, and mines underneath sent the lead half-track flying. Halvorsen was in the middle of it, crouched beside a collapsed tree stump, field glasses in one hand, a spool of wire in the other. "Hold the right flank," he yelled into a battered signal horn. "They're regrouping near the ridge." Private Lasko, mud-covered, now with a bullet graze across his temple, grabbed a satchel and sprinted to the ridge with 2 others. At the top, they had just enough time to unhook the last cable. 3 massive pine trees fell like guillotines. Crag, crag, crash. A German armored car tried to brake, skidded on wet moss and slammed into the trunks. Behind it, infantry scattered. A single American half-track rolled into the ridge clearing, mounted with a salvaged .37 gun and a pile of improvised HE rounds. It fired once, blew the turret clean off the armored car, and reversed, almost vanishing back into the brush like a ghost. They weren't just fighting, they were ambushing the ambushers. But it wasn't over. By 1100 the Germans had pulled back. The forest was eerily quiet, but Riley wasn't buying it. "They're not done," he said. "They're repositioning, trying to find a second trail." Halvorsen knew he was right. And then came the sound no one wanted to hear. Treads. Real treads, not half-tracks tanks. Panthers. Only 2 by the sound, but in the woods 2 panthers were overkill. Halvorsen stared at the tree line and muttered, "Too wide to fit our traps. They'll blast a path, bulldoze right through." Riley gritted his teeth. "Unless we trap them." They didn't have time to build more barricades, but they had one last weapon. The trail itself. If they could lure the Panthers into the stretch of Halvorson's run just before the stream crossing, the same gravel bed he'd noted in his original sketch, they could collapse the embankment beneath it. There was clay under the surface, soft, saturated. All they needed was a little help. Explosives, diesel, and the weight of two 45-ton tanks. Halvorson took the last remaining satchel charge and mounted it underneath the roots of a tree near the edge of the crossing. As he worked, mud up to his knees, he felt the vibrations before he heard them. The Panthers were coming. Not fast, cautious. They didn't know what was ahead, but they were pushing forward and fast enough that time was now measured in seconds. Halvorson shouted up to Lasko on the embankment, voice hoarse. "Set the fuses on 3. We bring it down when they're mid-cross." Riley scrambled to the far side with the two remaining Shermans, one already limping from a jammed turret. They didn't need to fight the Panthers. They just needed to make the ground disappear beneath them. The first Panther crested the incline, cannon slowly sweeping side to side. It paused at the edge of the stream, then rumbled forward. The second followed, 20 yards behind. The charges were set. "Now," Halvorson screamed, slamming the detonator. The ground erupted in a geyser of mud and clay. The embankment gave way. The front tread of the Panther collapsed into the creek. The tank tipped forward, its cannon sinking like a tombstone. The second Panther tried to reverse, but the weakened soil cracked beneath it. One by one, the Titan sank. By the time the smoke cleared, one Panther was nose down in the stream, turret jammed into a fallen tree. The other had its left tread suspended in midair, engine smoking, unable to move. Two tanks neutralized not by firepower, by a mechanic's eyes. Riley stumbled up beside Halvorson, coughing from the smoke. Did we just drown tanks?" Halvorson, covered in mud and reeking of cordite, nodded once. "Shortcut works both ways, Captain." By 1400, the 17th Cavalry had linked up with the unit, just as promised. Relief forces swept in through the northern farm roads. They found the forest littered with German wreckage, booby traps already marked with chalk for removal, and a field full of charred half-tracks. Halvorson slept for 18 hours straight, still wearing the same grease-stained uniform. When he woke, a staff officer from Corps HQ was waiting with a field citation in hand. "You've got one hell of a reputation now," the man said. "They're calling you the guy who broke open the forest." But Halvorson just looked past him, toward the trees, toward the trail that never should have worked, toward the path he'd built not from doctrine, but from memory, gut, and grease. A week after the breakout, the forest was quiet again. Smoke no longer clung to the treetops. The smell of diesel had faded, replaced by the natural damp scent of moss, pine needles, and overturned soil. But the marks were still there. Fresh gouges from tank treads, bark shredded by shrapnel, blackened patches where demo charges had scorched the undergrowth. Trees lay in precise rows where they'd been felled, not by age or weather, but by the calculated decisions of men in the middle of desperation. At the southern entrance of the trail, now marked, Halvorson's Run on operational maps, a small sign had been nailed to a stump. "No doctrine, just guts." Halvorson didn't put it there. Someone from the 498th did, likely Lasko or Weller, or one of the engineers who had dragged cables and winches through knee-deep mud and fought off SS vanguards with nothing but shovels and satchel charges. But Halvorson saw it when they brought him back in a jeep for one final survey, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. By now, the story had already outpaced him. He was being called the mechanic who broke the line. Some said he'd navigated the forest using only the stars. Others claimed he'd predicted German movements by tracking tire pressure in the mud. One rumor had him riding the lead Sherman on the turret, firing a .30 cal like a cowboy charging into a stampede. None of it was true, and somehow all of it was. In reality, Halvorsen was exhausted. His hands were blistered. His left ear still rang from the streambank explosion. He hadn't written home since June, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do now that the trail was open, the tanks were rolling, and he wasn't needed to scream instructions at people with more rank than him. The commendation came faster than he expected. 3 days later, a C-47 Dakota buzzed low over the division camp near St. Lo, kicking up dirt in its wake. From it stepped a 2-star general, flanked by aides with clipboards, camera gear, and far too many polished boots for a frontline zone. Major General John S. Wood of the 4th Armored Division had arrived to personally inspect the trail. But everyone knew why he was really there. When Halvorsen was summoned to the makeshift HQ tent, he expected to be chewed out for bypassing protocol, or maybe interrogated about how a corporal with no combat command training had somehow rerouted armor across a map sector that had been declared impassable by intelligence just a week prior. Instead, he was met with applause. Officers, mechanics, even a few French partisans who had drifted into the camp stood and clapped as he entered, confused, hat in hand, grease still under his nails. General Wood stepped forward, eyes crinkled with a grin. "You've cost the enemy 2 Panthers, 5 half-tracks, and 1 very irate logistics officer who says you rewrote the supply chain without permission." Laughter. Then the general's voice lowered. "But you saved lives. You moved an entire armored division when no one else could, and you did it not with orders, but with common sense and guts." From his coat, the general pulled a small box. Inside was a silver star. Halvorsen stared at it, blinking. I'm just a mechanic, sir." Wood smiled. "Then maybe we need more mechanics." He pinned the medal himself. And for a brief moment, just one, Halvorsen let himself feel it, not pride, not glory, but relief. That he hadn't failed them. That every broken-down tank he'd ever fixed, every sketch he'd made in the margins of ration books, every long night hunched over busted engines in muddy fields, that all of it had meant something. He nodded once, "Thank you, sir." And that was it. The general flew out that afternoon. Halvorsen went back to the motor pool. Weeks passed, then months. The trail became permanent. Bulldozers widened it. Engineers laid crushed stone. Supply convoys used it to reroute around mines and blocked roads for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. Veterans joked that Halvorsen's run was the only road in France where you were more likely to hit a tree trunk falling on purpose than one knocked over by artillery. Back in the States, Stars and Stripes ran a story titled, "Mechanic Turns Forest into Freeway, Yanks Stun Germans with Flank Attack That Shouldn't Exist." The photo was grainy, but you could just make out Halvorsen standing ankle-deep in mud, pointing into the trees, his wrench tucked into his belt like a saber. He didn't see the article until months later. By then they were pushing through the Siegfried Line. The forests there were thicker, colder, less forgiving. But every time a tank unit got bogged down in a ravine, someone would say, "Somebody get me a Halvorsen." And people knew what that meant. Not just a mechanic. A solution. After the war, he went home to Minnesota. He opened a garage. People brought him their broken tractors, their frozen-over fuel pumps, their blown transmissions. He fixed them all, quietly, methodically, never once charging more than he had to. He didn't talk about the war, not much. Until one day a young GI walked in, freshly returned from Korea. He looked nervous. "You Halvorsen." "That's what the sign says." "My uncle said you saved his tank, said you found a road that wasn't on any map." Halvorsen kept tightening the lug nut he was working on. "Wasn't a road," he muttered, "just trees and timing." The kid smiled. Well, he said to tell you thanks, said you probably don't remember him. Halvorsen looked up. I remember every tank. And then he turned back to the wheel hub, the light glinting off the old silver star, half covered in oil, pinned above his workbench. Because in the end, it wasn't about medals. It wasn't about tactics. It was about moving forward when no one else could. Even if it meant dragging an army through the woods, one wrench at a time.